Most of the time I took hits in a helicopter in Vietnam, it reminded me of the old Jiffy Pop popcorn. It just sounded like and felt like that, like popcorn hitting the lid of a pan or a Jiffy Pop. But in this case, on this day, with the large caliber anti-aircraft, what it felt like was there was a guy standing on the side of the aircraft with a jackhammer, just riveting that helicopter from back to front. And it took out my tail rotor, it took out the engine, it had rounds to the fuel cell, so we came down spinning and burning, hit nose low on the left side, bounced up, spun another turn and a half, and impacted. I got out of the aircraft, I survived the crash, looked for my front seat, Tim Connery. His canopy opened one direction, mine opened another, so we never got together on the ground. I wandered around for a time looking for him, eventually had to make a decision on what to do. I didn't think it made a lot of sense to try and get inside the camp because I'd have had to get from my crash through thousands of attacking enemy and tanks and through all the defensive position around Ben Het and not get shot by the friendlies in the process. So I elected, and I was badly hurt. I had a broken back, burns on the back of my neck, a shell fragment wound in my ankle, superficial wounds bleeding on my face, and my head just wasn't quite right. I'd been unconscious quite a bit. But I elected to move to the southeast towards Kontum. I went in that direction, succeeded for 3 days in doing that, avoiding capture, avoiding getting found by the enemy, avoiding friendly airstrikes. But on the third day, my luck ran out and I was captured by a group of South Vietnamese. I just stumbled onto them. They heard me. It was only a few seconds before they surrounded me in the jungle, AK-47 rifles pointed at my head and motioning me up. In the book, I try to describe that moment. I do a halfway okay job, I guess, but it's an impossible feeling, an impossible emotion to describe, having lost my freedom in that instance. Even though everything to that point had been dire. I mean, I described my injuries that I had. In addition to that, over the 3 days, I didn't have any control of my bowels or bladder. I had, my face was caked with blood and mud. I had leeches all over my body. I was in a bad, bad way, but I'd had the freedom to make decisions, the freedom to decide where I wanted to go, what direction I wanted to move in, and those were my choices. Now, from that moment through the rest of my captivity, all of those decisions were made by the enemy. The only freedom I had was freedom of thought in my head, and I cherished that. Well, not to get through all the detail, because I do want you to read the book if you're interested. The guys that captured me got an English-speaking interrogator. I was interrogated fairly brutally over a period of 3 days. My arms were tied behind my back ever tighter. The North Vietnamese loved to do things with ropes. They would tie my arms behind my back by the elbows, pulling the elbows closer and closer, until after a couple days of this, my elbows touched and my shoulders dislocated, and that was brutal. After some days of interrogation, I was moved to a camp in the jungles. I moved 1 day south and 2 days west, and ended up, what I have shown here as a jungle camp was in northern Cambodia, fairly safe from any American activity, and was held there for several weeks, lived in a bamboo cage with my feet in wooden stocks, and survived on a diet of rice, a ball of rice in the morning and a ball of rice in the evening, and just got sicker and sicker, and my ankle wound was getting very swollen and infected, and people were dying in that camp every day. The camp held about 300 prisoners, all South Vietnamese that had been captured in this offensive, except myself and one other American. And I can't remember a day when I didn't see him carry a body out to be buried, and indeed the young South Vietnamese soldier that was next to me in a cage that I was put in died several days after I got there. I don't know how long I would have survived. I only had to endure that camp for several weeks. On the 2nd of July, 1972, I was taken out of my cage and placed with a group of 25 South Vietnamese officers who were prisoners of war. Myself and the one other American in the camp, Wayne Finch, the only other American in the camp. We were told that we were going to be moved to a new camp, that it could be as far as 11 days away. It was going to be a tough trip, but when we got there, we'd get better food, we'd get medical care, and we'd get letters from home, probably, and that we should try very hard to make it. Well, And that last little bit didn't really register with me until we got going on the first day. And of course, this was all being talked by the communist camp commander in Vietnamese, and one of the young Vietnamese officers would translate for Wayne and I. We set out, tied loosely together, barefoot, through the jungle, trying to get to this new camp that would be as far as 11 days away. I had no idea how I would make it. I was in such bad shape. My ankle by that time, my whole leg by that time was badly swollen. I could barely move. As I took my first steps in the jungle, I didn't know how I would ever make it through that first day, let alone 11 days. But I did. Picked one foot up after the other, step after step after step, and somehow got through the first day. Got up the next morning and stood, and just the feeling of that fluid going back in my legs with the ankles, the legs so swollen and painful. It was excruciating pain, but I made it through the second day, and the third day, and the day after that, and the day after that. That trip, though, turned out to be not an 11-day trip to a new camp somewhere in northern Cambodia or even southern Laos or back into Vietnam. That trip turned out to be an over 3-month trek all the way up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And we walked every foot of the way, all the way up back into North Vietnam. Once inside North Vietnam, we did take trucks for a very few days, but most of the time we're walking there too. Before we got finally to the city of Hanoi, 6 of the South Vietnamese prisoners had died or were executed. Wayne Finch, the only other American, died at that death camp right there before we got north. I, by the grace of God, made it. I nearly died a bunch of times. Somebody was talking to me before this event started tonight about some of the South Vietnamese that helped me, and I bring that out in the book. I would not be alive if it weren't for a lot of things. But the help I got from Wayne Finch, the help I got from those South Vietnamese, particularly a couple guys that I highlight in the book. I had no idea how long the war would go on. I had no idea how long, how long I would be a prisoner. But my biggest challenges at first and until I got to Hanoi were just to survive, to see the sun come up the next day. I was so sick and so ill, and I didn't mention the other things. Yeah, after I got captured, and really many of them were beginning in that jungle camp and continued on that trip up north. And I know I had these things because I still had them when I got released, and in the hospital at Clark Air Base in the Philippines, they were diagnosed. I had 3 kinds of intestinal parasites, which I still had when I got released. I had amoebic dysentery, bloody dysentery. I had 3 different kinds of malaria, 3 different kinds. One of them very often fatal. It's amazing that I survived that. And then a condition called tropical sprue or malabsorption syndrome, and my guts just didn't absorb nutrients like they were supposed to. So with all of that, I was in dire straits, and I talked about watching other guys die. My motivation at first in the cages, I'm not sure exactly what it was, just to survive day to day to day. Once we started that trip north, it was, you've got a goal. I got to make it 11 days to get to that new camp. Somewhere along the way, it became known and was scuttlebutt, and prisoners were talking that we weren't going, we were going to go all the way to Hanoi. And then the motivation was get to Hanoi. If you get to Hanoi, you've got a chance. So get to Hanoi. And I dug down deep and did what I could with the help of others to get to Hanoi. After that, yeah, once in Hanoi, it was an unknown of when the war would be over. But once I got to Hanoi, I knew that I would survive for the first time. Any question I had of living was gone once I got to Hanoi. I knew I'd just have to gut out whatever the time was to the end of the war. And then luckily for me, it wasn't that long. I got to Hanoi in October, on October the 10th, 1972, and I was released on the 27th of March, 1973, so it was just several months. Yeah, not knowing it's hard. So what you have to have, are those intermediate goals I had, and then just the lust for life, the desire to live and stay alive and survive all of that. The Army during the entire Vietnam War never had a survival training program. What they had was at individual Army schools, they had something called survival training that they put together on their own that wasn't very involved. And I experienced it twice, once at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, when I was going to officer candidate school, and then again at Fort Rucker, Alabama, in flight school. And they give you a little bit of classroom on it. It was mostly survival, not resistance and escape. And then you went out for a survival exercise where they'd turn you out in the woods somewhere, and you had a point B that you were supposed to get to, and they had a lot of aggressors in between that would try to capture you. And if they captured you, they just threw you in a camp and abused you. I mean, there was nothing realistic about it, no real training that took place. But I was good enough on both those experiences to make it from my point A release point to my point B without getting captured, so I never got the benefit of whatever that prison camp experience was. I was one of 10 guys selected to go as a group and brief the Army Chief of Staff, General Creighton Abrams, on our experiences in Vietnam and any lessons learned. And in my little subgroup, the presentation we put together for the chief and for the Army staff was that our greatest challenge as prisoners of war, as Army prisoners of war, was fear of the unknown. We had no idea what to expect. We had no training program in the Army like the Air Force and the Navy have. And we strongly recommended that the Army come up with a series, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape course. And out of that briefing, the Army put together plans and eventually started a program at Fort Bragg, Carolina, and brought on board or brought back a prisoner, one of the only prisoners who escaped during the war. Nick Rowe was an Army Special Forces guy captured in the South and was held in a village that came under attack, and in the middle of the attack and the disarray, he got himself loose and waved at a helicopter and got picked up, but Nick was brought back on active duty to start that Army school. So that's the impact I had. I continue to go to Fort Rucker at least once, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year, to interact with the SERI program at Fort Rucker and help with that.